Principles of Emotional Management, a Practical Method. Introduction. Welcome to this talk on Principles of Emotional Management. Emotions are a natural part of human life. We experience happiness, sadness, anger, fear, irritation, disappointment, jealousy, anxiety, and many other emotional states. We cannot expect to eliminate emotions from our lives. The practical question is therefore not, how can we stop having emotions? The more useful question is, how can we manage our emotional responses so that negative emotions do not unnecessarily disturb our lives or lead us to harmful actions? The method I am going to explain today approaches emotional management in a systematic way. It begins with preparing the background. We try to reduce the situations that produce negative emotional responses. We prepare ourselves in advance for situations that cannot be avoided. We learn how to deal with emotional information when it repeatedly appears, and we learn how to minimize the harmful effects when an emotion has already taken control. Finally, we develop general patterns of behavior that reduce the overall occurrence and effects of negative emotions. Let us consider these principles one by one. A. Preparation of the background. A. 1. Avoid facing situations that could cause emotional responses. The first principle is very simple. Avoid facing situations that could cause unnecessary emotional responses. This does not mean that we should run away from every difficulty in life. Some difficulties must obviously be faced, but there are also many situations that we voluntarily expose ourselves to, even though we already know that they are likely to disturb us emotionally. A dot. 1.1. Do not visit such places. If a particular place repeatedly produces negative emotional reactions, and there is no real necessity to go there, we can simply avoid visiting it. For example, suppose a person knows that going to a particular place regularly leads to arguments, resentment, or other emotional disturbances. If there is no important reason to go there, avoiding that place may be a sensible form of emotional management. The same principle applies in modern life. A person may know that repeatedly looking at certain social media discussions makes them angry or anxious. If there is no necessity to follow those discussions, there is no reason to expose the mind to them repeatedly. In such a situation, avoiding the trigger is not weakness, it is preparation. A 1.2. Prepare the environment to overcome such triggering situations. Sometimes, however, we cannot simply avoid a situation. We may have to go to work. We may have to deal with difficult people. We may have responsibilities toward family members. We may have to attend meetings or perform duties that we cannot escape. In such circumstances, we can prepare the environment so that the triggering situation has less influence over us. For example, if a particular type of conversation normally leads to an argument, we can decide beforehand how we are going to respond. We may choose not to answer immediately, or we may arrange the circumstances so that the discussion takes place when everyone is calmer. The important point is to prepare before the emotional reaction occurs. A point 2. Sustain temperaments and moods that resist negative emotions. The second principle is sustain temperaments and moods that resist negative emotions. Our emotional reaction to a situation is influenced not only by what happens, but also by the state of mind we bring to that situation. A 2.1. Be aware of the mood that is likely to generate negative emotional reaction under specific conditions. We should become aware of the moods that are likely to generate negative emotional reactions under particular circumstances. For example, a person may discover that when tired, hungry, or under pressure, a small criticism produces a much stronger reaction than it normally would. Another person may notice that after spending a long time reading disturbing information online, they become more irritable when speaking with family members. The important thing is to recognize the connection. We should ask ourselves, under what conditions am I more likely to react negatively? Once we understand this, we can begin to prepare ourselves. A .2 cultivate resisting mechanism in advance to change the mind to a more favorable mood. The next step is to cultivate a mechanism in advance that can change the mind into a more favorable mood. This preparation is important because once an emotional reaction becomes strong, controlling it becomes more difficult. For example, before entering a difficult meeting, we may spend a few moments calming the mind and reminding ourselves not to react immediately to criticism. Similarly, before answering a message that has irritated us, we can pause rather than responding while the emotion is strong.